Daniel had promised himself he would never spend another evening alone with his ex-girlfriend's mother. Not because Margaret had ever treated him badly, but because their family history made everything complicated. Yet that Friday night, circumstances put them together in the same car, miles from home, with no easy way out. Margaret had asked Daniel for a ride after her car developed trouble outside town. Her daughter Emily was away visiting friends, so Daniel agreed without hesitation. He never expected the weather to turn dangerous. Within an hour, heavy rain covered the highway, visibility disappeared, and their borrowed car suddenly stopped. Daniel tried restarting the engine several times, but nothing happened. Margaret looked through the windshield at the empty road ahead. Rain hammered the roof while distant thunder shook the windows. She sighed and whispered that they might be there for a while. Daniel smiled and promised they would figure something out. The car slowly became colder as the minutes passed. Daniel turned off unnecessary electronics to preserve the battery. Margaret wrapped her coat tightly around herself and stared into the darkness outside. Neither spoke for several minutes. Finally, Margaret broke the silence and admitted she was nervous about something completely unrelated. Daniel looked at her curiously. She explained that Emily had been asking questions about their friendship lately. Margaret had avoided giving detailed answers because she didn't want to create another argument. Daniel understood immediately. His relationship with Emily had ended peacefully, but certain memories still made family gatherings uncomfortable. "I don't want her misunderstanding anything," Margaret said quietly. Daniel agreed. He didn't want Emily thinking he was secretly meeting her mother either. Their situation already looked suspicious enough without adding unnecessary complications. Margaret gave him a grateful smile, then looked outside again as another flash of lightning illuminated the road. After another unsuccessful attempt to start the car, Daniel decided they should call roadside assistance. Unfortunately, the signal was weak, and his phone repeatedly failed to connect. Margaret tried hers too. Nothing worked. They were completely stranded, surrounded by darkness, rain, and miles of empty countryside. Waiting became their only option. Margaret suddenly laughed, surprising Daniel. He asked what was funny about their situation. She said that years ago, she would have considered being trapped in a car with her daughter's ex-boyfriend completely impossible. Daniel laughed too. Somehow, humor made the uncomfortable situation feel less frightening for both of them. As they continued waiting, Margaret began talking about Emily's childhood. She shared funny stories about school performances, lost bicycles, family vacations, and the first time Emily had brought Daniel home. Daniel remembered that evening clearly. Margaret had welcomed him warmly, making him feel comfortable almost immediately despite his nervousness. Daniel admitted that he still remembered how kind Margaret had been during their relationship. Even when he and Emily argued, Margaret never took sides. She encouraged both of them to communicate honestly. Margaret smiled and said she always believed relationships required patience, but sometimes two good people simply weren't right together. The rain continued falling heavily. Margaret looked at Daniel and asked whether he ever regretted breaking up with Emily. Daniel thought carefully before answering. He said he regretted hurting her, but he didn't regret choosing honesty. Staying together simply because they were afraid of change would have been unfair to both of them. Margaret nodded slowly. She said Emily had eventually understood that too, although it had taken time. She then admitted something surprising. Emily had recently started seeing someone new. Daniel felt relieved rather than jealous. He told Margaret that he genuinely hoped Emily was happy. Margaret seemed pleased by his answer. For a while, they simply listened to the rain. The car felt strangely peaceful despite their uncomfortable circumstances. Margaret finally turned toward Daniel and said, "Don't tell her about this." Daniel immediately understood she meant their private conversation, not anything inappropriate. He promised he wouldn't share personal details without her permission. She explained that Emily didn't need to know every conversation her mother had with her former boyfriend. Sometimes people created unnecessary drama by imagining meanings that didn't exist. Daniel agreed completely. Their conversation had simply been honest, respectful, and unexpectedly comforting. Nothing more needed to be attached to it. Eventually, the rain weakened. Daniel stepped outside and checked beneath the hood again. After several minutes, he discovered that a loose connection had caused the problem. He tightened it carefully, returned to the driver's seat, and tried the ignition. The engine started immediately. Margaret clapped with genuine relief and laughed. They drove slowly toward the nearest town, where they stopped at a small roadside cafe. Warm lights filled the windows, and the smell of coffee greeted them when they entered. Margaret ordered tea while Daniel chose coffee. They sat quietly, realizing their strange night had finally become a memorable story. At the cafe, Margaret thanked Daniel for staying calm. She admitted that she had been frightened when the car stopped. Daniel said he had been nervous too, but someone had to pretend everything was under control. Margaret laughed and said his confidence had made the situation easier than it actually was. Before leaving, Margaret asked Daniel whether he thought they should tell Emily about the breakdown. Daniel said she could know the basic story, but their private conversation could remain private. Margaret agreed. She said some moments were better remembered by the people who experienced them rather than explained to everyone else. When Daniel eventually dropped Margaret home, the rain had completely stopped. She opened the passenger door, paused, and thanked him once more. Then she smiled and said that despite everything, she was glad they had been stranded together. Daniel laughed and replied that he preferred future conversations without broken cars or thunderstorms. The next morning, Emily called Daniel unexpectedly. She asked whether he had driven her mother home safely. Daniel smiled and said everything was fine. Emily thanked him for helping Margaret and admitted she appreciated knowing they could still treat each other respectfully. Daniel felt relieved that there was no awkward misunderstanding. Weeks later, Margaret occasionally joked about their stranded car adventure. Daniel always reminded her that they had been incredibly lucky to find the mechanical problem. Margaret would smile and say she believed some inconveniences happened for a reason. Their experience hadn't created a secret romance or complicated relationship. It created understanding. Daniel eventually realized the night had taught him something important. Not every emotional connection needed to become romantic, and not every secret needed to be suspicious. Sometimes two people could share a difficult moment, speak honestly, protect someone's feelings, and walk away with deeper respect for each other than before.